Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome. This is Andy Moreno with the Food Pathogen Outbreak Recall Response Group from LinkedIn. And today we are waiting for Dr. David Acheson to come on the line, and he's going to chat with us about the Food Safety Modernization Act. And I believe he's on the line right now. Dr. Acheson? Dr. Acheson, are you available?
Yes, I am. I'm here, and it's good to be with you.
Very good. As I've already introduced you to the group, the Food Safety Outbreak and Response Group, if you have a brief minute, Dr. Acheson, I was wondering if you could outline your background for the group and particularly your experience at the FDA.
No, I'd be happy to. Well, currently I'm a consultant in the food sector, working for a consulting firm called Leavitt Partners, based in Salt Lake City, but I operate out of Washington, D.C. Been doing that about 2 years. Prior to that, I was at the Food and Drug Administration, initially as the Chief Medical Officer in the food part of the agency, Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. And then the last 3 years as the Assistant and then Associate Commissioner for Foods in the agency, which was giving me an overall responsibility for providing insights and expertise to the Commissioner at FDA around all food-related issues, including Food Safety Modernization Act, which it wasn't then, but as we were sort of moving in that general direction. And prior to that, started out my career as a physician. I spent 10 years doing internal medicine and infectious diseases in the UK, where I grew up, and then about 12 years at Tufts University in Boston. I'm working on the basic molecular mechanisms of foodborne pathogens. So one way or another, treating it, understanding it, or regulating it, I've been in the food safety world for about 30 years.
Outstanding. You know, today's discussion is focusing on how food producers have relatively been unpoliced for the last few years, probably since the inception of our country. And now the FDA is taking an active role as a result of the enactment of the Food Safety Modernization Act. How is your response as the former leader of this group in its cultural perspective toward food producers in general?
You know, I think that what we're seeing, and this was a trend that really began 5 years ago, maybe slightly longer. And if you want to try to draw a line in the sand where some of this thinking shifted, it was probably the spinach outbreak in 2006, linked to E. coli. When I think that was a trigger point when the FDA finally said we need to develop preventive strategies that work and not just reactive strategies. And what we've seen here is the culmination of that approach going right through to the signing of the Food Safety Modernization Act in January this year and then beyond. And more so, the FDA has been taking more robust enforcement actions. There's been more recalls. There's been more warning letters. And I think that the FDA has moved from a traditional approach of let's look at all the companies that we regulate. And domestically, that's about 150,000 manufacturers, processors, distributors, and warehouses. These are the companies that have to register with FDA. It doesn't include farms, it doesn't include food service, and it doesn't include retail. That puts the number way higher. But those have been the focus of the agency. And typically, the FDA has looked at a food commodity and said, this is a high-risk food. We're going to inspect those companies annually. Lower-risk foods less often than very low-risk foods hardly ever, if ever. And the shift has been, no. Okay, we now need to look at multiple things that raise risk. The food's part of it. But what's the history of this facility? Have they had problems? Have we been in there once before and seen that they barely have their systems under control? And to give you an example of what I'm talking about here, Andy, is that the infant formula industry has classically been one that the FDA regulates very heavily. Why? Because it's, for the most part, sole source nutrition for a very vulnerable population, i.e. babies. So the FDA goes in there every year, and for the vast majority of visits, everything's looking perfect. They don't need to be there, really. It's running extremely well. There's no problems. Occasionally there are, but for the most part, there's a very strong track record. So what we're going to see from FDA is as they have to build risk-based inspection strategies focused on prevention, they are going to be using a different metric to figure out who to go and visit. And when they go, their visit is going to look different. They are going to be, once we start to see the regulations kick in from the Food Safety Modernization Act, particularly around preventive controls and food safety plans, we are going to see an FDA going in there not with a show us the plan that you're working on. We want to see the binder. We want to see this all written out. Yeah, they may well ask for that, but what they'll really want to know is, are you implementing that plan? Show us that you've got the systems in place. Show us that when you have a problem, you know how to do a corrective action and a root cause analysis, and that you've got it documented. That's how the regulators are going to be approaching this, and not just with the classic HACCP type thinking of looking at your process, but I think we're going to see more and more focus on what is often called good manufacturing practices or prerequisite programs, the sanitation, the infrastructure, the hygiene, the product tracking, your capacity to recall, how you react to customer and consumer complaints. The agency is going to be looking at a lot of those things as well, and they're doing more and more of that, and it's just ramping up over time, and it will continue to accelerate.
Dr. Acheson, you bring up an excellent point, and that's the operations of the food producers, and that'll be examined when the inspectors come in. We had discussed earlier that the ratio, you're saying about 150,000 companies, how many inspectors are there?
Not very many. The FDA has, the inspectorate within FDA is in the Office of Regulatory Affairs, as distinct from the centers where much of the policy and the science is driven. So the Office of Regulatory Affairs has a total staff of about, it's probably running at the order of about 3,000 individuals. Many of those are in Washington, managing the inspectorate. The inspectorate is out in the field, the rest of them. They are broken up into a number of districts, 20 different districts and several different regions. And overall, there's probably of the order of about 1,700 to 2,000 FDA inspectors total. And that includes food and medical products. So it's really not very many to go around.
You know, that's interesting how you mentioned that. What I was focusing in this discussion, I was hoping to focus on, was how, in the event of an outbreak and a recall, what's the FDA inspector's motivation for coming into a food producer's production facility?
No, that's a really good question, and I think that the motivation is going to be driven by some of the factors that lead up to the visit. So maybe we should just dissect for a minute what might cause that inspector to decide he's going to go and visit a specific processor. And an outbreak starts obviously with somebody consuming or being exposed to a food that's made them sick, and they've gone and seen a physician, and the physician's made a diagnosis, and they have connected an illness with a patient, and the local and the state health departments will go through the process of interviewing sick patients and asking them what they ate and where they ate it in the weeks before they became sick, usually a week or so. And they'll use that information to begin to develop a short list of foods that are potentially implicated as the cause of this outbreak. This is an epidemiological process. There typically isn't any food testing going on at this point because the food often has not been identified. But that process has over the years been pretty robust in terms of identifying foods that have subsequently turned out to be problematic. As this process is evolving through the states and the Centers for Disease Control, the FDA and the USDA also, it's essentially the same process, are sort of passive bystanders to this observing how this is moving forward and what it looks like is the implicated food. And at the end of that process, the Centers for Disease Control will likely say, we have a statistical degree of certainty that it's such and such a food that has caused this illness. And this could be as narrow as a specific brand of a product, or it could be as broad as a commodity. And we've seen many examples of commodities that have been implicated, and I think two that everyone will remember is spinach in 2006, where it was very unclear who was what brands were implicated. So the concern was it's spinach, but we don't know from whom or from where. And the other classic example was the tomatoes that subsequently turned out to be peppers, where there was very little insight as to where that had come from initially. The flip of that is when the epidemiology drives you to a specific brand, a specific product. So with those events having been the trigger, if it's a broad commodity thing, the FDA is going to be really putting out a wide swath, and they're going to be doing a traceback, and they want to know from the consumer who got sick. You start saying, you got sick? Where did you buy your tomatoes? Oh, well, I bought them from such and such a supermarket. Supermarket will get a visit from FDA, and their purpose is to discover where did you get your tomatoes from in this particular time frame. And that's really a discovery component. It's unlikely that the regulators will be thinking the supermarket was responsible for the problem, particularly obviously if it's a multi-state outbreak. So that then tracks back, well, the retailer got those tomatoes from a distributor. FDA goes to the distributor, asks the same set of questions. And so it works back through a repacker and all the way down to a farm. And at each visit, the FDA is just simply seeking information about the product tracking. Where did you get it from? What did you do with it? And who did you ship it to? At some point in all of that...
You had mentioned that, I'm going to break in here at this point,
the
term of linkage. Could you explore that? I think you're heading right toward it.
Well, exactly. The whole point of this exercise is to triangulate to one source that is considered probably to be the likely origin of the problem. Now, that may be a farm, it may be a processor, it could be a distributor, and it's about going down these separate tracks and finding, okay, there's a point of commonality, and at that point, the FDA's approach when the inspector shows up is not just we just simply want to know how product tracked through you. It changes to we think you are the source of the problem. And that is a very different visit. And if you are in the we think you're the source of the problem mode visit in an outbreak situation, then what you will find is that FDA inspectors will be showing up and really wanting to understand your process, your risks. They will likely arrive with significant amounts of sampling material. They will want to test finished product. They'll want to test product that's in the works. They'll want to potentially test ingredients. They will be wanting to swab your environment, your contact surfaces, your floors, your walls, your drains, and they will be looking for the microbe, whether it be Listeria or Salmonella or E. coli, that has been responsible for the outbreak. And, as often happens in situations like this, when they show up, they find it. And they link it back to, they say, okay, we've now found the source of this product. The main mission of FDA in this initial phase is to shut it down. They want to stop exposures. Then they want to figure out how it happened in the first place.
Dr. Acheson, I want to kind of break in here for a minute. And you had mentioned that every situation is different. And the question is, what is the standard of proof? And there have been several widely publicized cases where the actual producer that was zeroed in had negative test results, and yet they were still under an order. Can you identify that thinking for us?
Great question. And the standard of proof is, I honestly believe that there isn't a clear delineation of that. The one clarity to that is that if a sealed product has tested positive for a pathogen, and that pathogen has been linked to an outbreak, that is a standard of proof that is hard to refute, assuming that the chain of custody and that the laboratory methods are robust. That is a pretty rock-solid standard. What more frequently happens is that it's the epidemiology. It's this process of what did you eat and where did you eat it, and doing the statistical analysis of that leads the regulator to then focus in on what we've just been discussing of getting in the plant. So in that situation, the standard of proof comes through statistics, and it comes by looking at the odds that the assumption is correct. It is an odds game, and it literally is called the odds ratio, where statistically, if it's evens, it's like, well, could be, maybe not. When you get an odds ratio of 1, it can go either way. When you get an odds ratio of 2, it's clearly tipping in favor of one way or the other. There's been situations I've been involved with. The classic one would be cookie dough that was linked to E. coli. No positive samples. It was purely epidemiology. Not that many people sick even, I think 20 or so. And the epidemiologist in Oregon was working that case, and he calculated an odds ratio there, and if my memory serves me correctly, it was 80, which is extremely high. And there you're saying, whoa, this is clear, but you don't have a positive. And the danger there is it right or is it wrong? It's statistical. The spinach situation, the epidemiology led us to believe it was spinach. They led CDC to believe it was spinach. Ultimately, spinach was found to be contaminated with the Outbreak strain, bags of spinach. But it took a couple of weeks. Another great example would be back in 2007. There was the first really significant peanut butter recall was it was an outbreak of salmonella. The Centers for Disease Control had determined that it was a particular brand from a particular company, and it was statistics. It was purely statistics. And when the company was approached, they had exactly what you said. They had copious testing data that was negative, and through discussion with the company decided we're going to do a voluntary recall anyway. They looked at the data, they looked at the epidemiology, and said, we believe this, reluctantly perhaps, but we believe it. And then down the road, as consumers came forward with jars of peanut butter and also having had the same outbreak strain, and they said, well, yeah, I've got one of those jars at home. And they were sent into the lab, and they tested positive. So again, that was proof. And ultimately, the outbreak strain was found in the facility. So it all came together. So there is, it's a fantastic question. What is the standard of proof? And there are many who say the only standard we will accept is a positive out of our sample. And experience has taught me that more often than not, the epidemiology is right. Is it fallible? Yeah, it's fallible. And it is an odds ratio that you're looking at, and it's a statistical probability, which is never 100%.
Well, Dr. Acheson, we had chatted earlier about particular cases where the FDA was, in fact, negligent in their statistical gathering, and their analytical tests came up short, and yet they imposed a ban against a particular product coming into the United States. You're involved in one of them. Can you talk generally how that works and how a food producer can protect themselves or at least assert their rights?
Well, I think the most important aspect for a food producer is that you just never know when one of these things is going to be on your front doorstep. The notion that food producers will have some sense as to whether they are working with a higher risk versus a lower risk product, that's how does one define that? Products that have been repeatedly associated with problems, you know that it's hard to control the risk and so on and so forth. But we've seen many an example where a, quote, low-risk product has suddenly found itself in a bad place and linked to illness. So the first question is to ask yourself, am I high risk, low risk? And when you answer that question, you may say, well, I don't need to worry if I'm low risk, and that's the wrong conclusion to take. It means that the likelihood is less, but you still need to worry. So what do you do? Well, probably the most important thing is that when you get these kinds of situations arise, is you have got to have access to people who really understand how to help you. Large companies have these people on staff. Smaller, medium-sized companies, not necessarily. And you need swift access to an expert who can help you navigate this environment of, so what is this epidemiology telling me? What is this odds ratio telling me? Do I need to do something? How much trouble am I in? They've said they found listeria in my product. What does that mean? Does that mean people are going to just have a bit of bellyache, or are they going to die? They found salmonella in my product. What does that mean? So there's this process that needs to happen, and it needs to happen quickly. And there are definitely situations that I've seen where a company will look at the data and say, I'm not quite sure I buy into this. I can see that there's a potential problem here. Let me talk to the agency about it, to FDA about it. And the end result of that is that, there's a problem, but the initial reaction from FDA may be that we need to recall vast amounts of product. And where this ends up is that you recall just a small amount of product, because you can narrow it based on lot codes and product tracking and your data that you've got in your facility around preventive controls and testing, and also understanding the epidemiology of when people got sick, where they lived, how sick they got, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very difficult to have all that expertise in-house on an ongoing basis. So you absolutely need to be preparing for the worst and get folk who can address those kinds of questions just in your Rolodex and connected, so that they're able to help you when the bad stuff happens.
Fascinating. Dr. Acheson, I was going to allow you a few minutes to explain how Leavitt Partners provides strategic counsel and advice regarding these challenges. Is that possible?
Well, absolutely. No, I appreciate that. It is certainly it's a fun topic to discuss. It's a very unfun topic to be on the wrong side of. What we are doing in our firm is working with a variety of food companies, large and small, from farm through to retail food service, as well as some ancillary technologies, to help them get in a better place to prevent these things from happening in the first place, and then to be at their side when they do happen. So really building off my credentials and the credentials of our team to understand where the risk is and do our ultimate working with a company to prevent it happening in the first place, by looking at how a company is controlling its risk, and then more importantly, are they prepared for the crisis when it hits, and then when it does hit, being, as I said earlier, being with them to be able to navigate this environment, which is always fast and unpleasant, and one to be avoided at all costs, but with the best will in the world and the best preventive controls that I've seen in the most up-to-date, sophisticated food facilities. Every now and again, stuff goes wrong, and so that's essentially where we're at. We try to minimize the likelihood of that, and when it does happen, be there with a client to help them through it.
Outstanding. In the last 3 minutes, I was wondering if you could outline for us an exercise that's required by the Food Safety Modernization Act. It's called a mock outbreak and recall exercise. Can you identify some of the salient points that these companies should be practicing in the hopefully unlikely event of a recall?
That's, again, a good question. And this speaks to having a robust crisis management plan. And what this means is that a company has got on paper and has practiced, to your question, has practiced recall plans and a recall situation. Now, you may be doing a recall that's got nothing to do with an outbreak. That can happen. You discover that you have used a contaminated ingredient in a product that was shipped to you, and you've shipped the product out the door. You've got to recall it. Not your fault, but it's your problem. So absolutely have a plan. Who's in charge? There's various ways to build these plans. You can do it through incident command structures, which is what a lot of law enforcement use. It's what the FDA is focused on using. You don't have to, but it works well. So you need to know who you're going to get, where they are 24/7, and a backup. Have a process to be able to identify the right experts, legal, media, communications, subject matter, get them together quickly, and you rehearse this. That's essentially what we're talking about here. And that approach, that crisis management around a food issue, will serve you well whether you are dealing with the recall that I just described, where it was just simply a pass-through, but you've got to get your product off the shelf, or whether it's the worst case that we were talking about earlier, where the FDA knocks on your door and says, we think that you caused an outbreak, and we need to get in there. Either way, you need that same team with that same skill set to be able to manage it.
Well, Dr. Acheson, in the 1 minute remaining, I'd like to offer you the opportunity to close this discussion, particularly with advice to the smaller producers of food in the United States as they look forward to facing the bracing impact of the Food Safety Modernization Act.
I think the most important aspect for small companies at this point is to do their best to understand what they're going to need to do. The regulations are not written yet in their entirety. Some are, but most aren't. So it's really going to be important to stay informed in process. And obviously through venues such as this, you have the capacity to do that. Learn what's going to happen. Start to think today about how you will approach building a food safety plan. Understand what it means to do that. And it's not that complicated. And there's a lot of information out there. And again, from our perspective, we provide
Dr.
that kind of
Acheson,
information.
we have 5 seconds, so I'd like to thank you very much for participating today and look forward to having our clients participate with you. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye.